Hey everyone, I'm Catherine and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be tackling another Australian true crime case. This case is commonly referred to as the Snowtown Murders, the bodies in the barrel case. However, I do note that the majority of the murders that we will be discussing today didn't actually happen in the town of Snowtown. They happened in different areas of South Australia. The two serial killers that take the focus of today's case are named Robert Wagner and John Bunting. Now I have to start this video with a severe trigger warning because it involves a range of horrific and gruesome themes, including cannibalism, electrocution, severe torture, pedo, and different types of... I have to be careful about the words that I say on YouTube, otherwise I will be demonetized, but I'll put a list of the trigger warning themes just here. Let's jump right in. Police investigator Paul Schramm was given the task of reviewing some of the cold missing persons files that had gone stagnant. So they weren't closed. So they had some suspicious parts of the cases and they weren't closed, but they'd gone cold. They'd hit a dead lead. So he asked his fellow colleagues, well, which 10 cases should I take a second look at? And he says that the reason he asked for the 10 cases that they would suggest he take a second look at is because people only disappear for one of three reasons. They want to, one. Another is they've taken their own life, two. And the third reason being that they have met with foul play and gone missing under suspicious circumstances. So because he was new to these cases, he basically asked the officers who already had a bit of a background, knowledge to the missing persons cases, well, which 10 should I focus on? And of course, the existing police officers said, well, these 10 they don't look like suicide. It doesn't look like the person has decided to go. So they basically gave him 10 cases to review that they thought had some suspicious parts to the cases. The first missing person case that the detective started to look at was Clinton Davies. He says that there wasn't much to go off. Apparently Davies went missing from his apartment and there wasn't much. There was no leads. It just looked like he could have just wandered off. The next person he started to look at was a man who went missing in the early 1990s by the name of Barry Lane. But what he found interesting was that Barry Lane and Davies were actually associates. And it turns out that they used to live with one another in the early 1990s, around the time that both of them went missing. There were rumors around town that apparently missing Barry Lane and Clinton were in a physical homosexual relationship together. Missing person Barry Lane had an extensive criminal record. He was a known pedophile and he had an extensive criminal record involving those types of offences and other types of violent offences. Upon further investigation, it became clear to the police that both Clinton and Barry were receiving the pension. So what the police identified, which was strange and is often a sign that the person or people are still alive, is that their pensions were still being collected. The missing person's pensions were still being collected from a little service station just north of Adelaide. The police put surveillance cameras in the small service station so they could identify the person who was coming to collect the pension. And the police observed the CCTV footage and they saw that it was not Barry Lane who was collecting his pension. It was another man. The police were able to identify the man who was collecting the pension, or Barry's pension, as a man by the name of Robert Wagner. Now, they waited 2 more weeks, and 2 weeks later again, when the pension came out, Robert Wagner went and he withdrew the funds. They decided to follow Robert Wagner around to kind of get a vibe, what's this guy up to? And they saw that Robert Wagner would always go back and spend time with his associate by the name of John Bunting. Upon some further investigation and talking with other people in the community, the police identified that both John and Robert were associates with the 2 missing men, Barry Lane and Clinton. Police uncovered that John Bunting and Robert Wagner usually hung out together at John Bunting's house in Salisbury North, where he lived with his wife. And the more the officer started to investigate the missing persons and a range of different other missing persons from the area, the more it became clear that both John and Robert were associates and friendly with the missing persons. Essentially, John Bunting and Robert Wagner were linked by association with a range of missing persons from the Salisbury North area. The case took an ominous turn in 1998 when a woman by the name of Elizabeth Hayden went missing. It was suspicious and the police went to speak to her husband, Mark Hayden. During the police's discussion with Mark Hayden, it became clear that he was also friends with a man named John Bunting. So again, John Bunting was linked to this missing person case somehow. Mark Hayden, however, told police that he and his ex-wife had an argument, that they separated, and that she just took off and left. And that was his story to the police. The police investigation took a grim turn when the police continued to investigate and speak with Hayden's neighbours. It became clear that Elizabeth Hayden drove a white Land Cruiser, and that around the time she went missing, the neighbours observed John Bunting and Robert Wagner filling the Land Cruiser, Elizabeth's Land Cruiser, with garbage bags. It became clear that the Land Cruiser was a crucial piece of information that the police could investigate to see what truly happened to the missing woman, Elizabeth Hayden. Now, the police interviewed Bunting, Wagner, and they'd already interviewed Mark, and they found it disturbing that each of them gave a very different recount of events as to what happened on the day that they were observed by the neighbours to be loading the garbage bags into the Land Cruiser, where the Land Cruiser was, and why they needed the Land Cruiser that day. Bunting and Wagner were soon to be linked to yet another missing person by the name of Suzanne Allen. So apparently they were friends with her, they were associates with her, and around the time that she went missing, neighbours observed them loading her furniture into a car. By the year 1995, the missing persons cases involving Clinton Trezell, Elizabeth Hayden, Barry Lane, and Susan Allen were all considered to be crimes rather than missing persons. So the police had enough to go off to say that these are no longer just missing persons that have reached a dead end. Something suspicious has happened, and that these people were linked. Police observed that another man by the name of Ray Davies had also been missing since 1995, and he was actually the lover of Suzanne Allen. By the year 1999, the police investigations were still ongoing, slowly, and the police were pretty certain that Bunting and Wagner were associated with all 5 of the missing persons. The police comment that we're talking about a very low socioeconomic area, part of South Australia, where the unemployment rate was really high. A lot of people didn't have jobs, and there was a high crime rate. A lot of people were bored. The police started to look into John Bunting's upbringing, his family, and it became clear that John Bunting didn't have an extensive criminal record. There were a couple of minor offences, but no assaults, nothing violent or gruesome on his record. They spoke to his family and his friends, and it became clear that John displayed some troubling behaviours as a youth. He used to kill insects and kill small animals, and his parents observed that as he got older, he started killing larger animals, and he seemed to just like to watch what happened. He was said to put some insects and bugs into acid and see how long it would take the insects and bugs to die, and that he had a bit of a fascination with death and murdering animals. John's parents were actually good, decent, honest people, and John grew up in the suburb of Anala. John Bunting did disclose that as a child, he endured sexual at the hand of his older brother's friend, and the police believe that this had a significant impact on John Bunting's mental capacity, his mental health, and his future, and what happened to John. Similarly, it turned out that Robert Wagner was also sexually abused as a child, and so John and Robert had that in common. You can see from the photos that Robert Wagner was a tall, broody type of guy, and that John Bunting was the smaller guy, and it is said and commonly accepted that Wagner was more of Bunting's henchman, and they just got along like a house in fire. And that Bunting, he was so charismatic, charming, and he really made friends with a lot of people that were vulnerable in the community, and they all kind of looked up to him as some sort of leader and a family. One of the associates that really adored and admired John Bunting was Mark Hayden, and you'll recall Elizabeth Hayden is the woman that went missing in 1998, and she really took a lot of the police's focus with respect to the missing person investigation. It is said that Elizabeth wasn't the most intelligent woman, and neither was Mark, and Mark was reported to just admire and adore John Bunting. Now, reports from family and friends said that John Bunting developed a dislike for Elizabeth. She was a bit loud, outspoken, and generally annoying. And it is said that Mark started to take John's side and kind of developed a dislike for his own wife, and this very strong connection and love and admiration for John Bunting. Because the missing persons cases were now being treated as potential homicides, they went from given less priority, less resources, to the police having a lot more resources to investigate these missing persons cases. Now, part of the resources included that the police were given the ability to surveil and to listen in on Bunting and Wagner's phone conversations. And what they discovered was that they were speaking with a man from Snowtown quite frequently, and that they were going to visit a place in Snowtown quite frequently. Snowtown is a very, very small rural suburb, and the population is in the low hundreds. Again, it's a low socioeconomic place. The police started to investigate Snowtown as a suburb or a town of interest, and they made a significant finding. They found the missing woman, Elizabeth Hayden's Land Cruiser, in Snowtown, and the police went to speak to the man that Mark Hayden, John Bunting and Robert Wagner kept going to visit, and that man admitted and said, yeah, I've become friends with them. They've started to rent the old bank building that's up here. The witness that the police went to speak to said that they observed 3 huge black barrels that were in the Land Cruiser that they said that they were taking to store at the bank building, and of course this raised the police's suspicions even further. So here is a photo of the bank that they were renting. And here is the police footage of when they first entered the police bank vault and what they saw.
So they undid the tape, just peered into the darkness of the vault, and they filmed 6 large black barrels, packets of rubber gloves, some bottles of acid.
The police discovered 6 large-size black barrels, and the walls of the bank vault appeared to be covered in plastic. One of the police officers observed what looked like a human mummified foot that was on the ground, and the police started to open the barrels, and what they found in the barrels was body parts, decapitated body parts, and it looked like several bodies had been cut up and placed into these barrels and hidden in the old bank vault. Now, upon further investigation, you could see packets of acid that were laid around the place, and I think what Bunting and Wagner intended to do was to, burn or, destroy the evidence, but because they used the wrong concentration of acid in the barrels, what actually ended up happening is the body parts were perfectly preserved, and the next task for the police to do would be to take all of the body parts out, identify how many bodies there were in total in the barrels, and also who the bodies belonged to. Now, the police noted that because of the preservation of the bodies in the barrels, they had fantastic evidence to go off. I mean, you could even see the marks. You could clearly identify how the people had been murdered, and their tattoos remained intact because of the preservation, the unintended preservation from the murderers. The police arrested John Bunting, Robert Wagner and Mark Hayden, and all 3 of the men refused to speak to the police regarding the case. The police received numerous phone calls via Crime Stoppers regarding people who wanted to help them with their investigation into the 3 men. However, one person called and said to the police, you want to go and check out X address at Salisbury North, you're going to find more bodies there. So the police listened to this person. They went to the address that was given. They used a police radar and they discovered more bodies that had been buried at that location. One of the bodies was that of Suzanne Allen, and the other was the Mr. Davies. And Ray Davies, who had been missing since 1995. So they knew whoever we've spoken to on the phone knows more than, there's someone else that we should really be speaking to about these missing persons. The police also identified that the last person who had been renting the premises was John Bunting. Police identified the person who had given them the significant tips as a man by the name of Jamie Vazarkis. Jamie said that he had a lot more information that he wanted to give to the police, and he attended the police station and provided a significant statement which basically gave the police all of the information they needed to convict, or charge and convict, Wagner, Bunting and Mark Hayden. Jamie Vazarkis endured a horrific childhood. He too was sexually by his own father. His father died, and his mother then began to date the one and only John Bunting. He grew up with John Bunting as somewhat as a stepfather, and for the majority of his upbringing, he adored John. It is also said that Jamie was sexually by his own brother, and that John became aware of this. Now, John and Robert Wagner, as you're aware, also endured significant sexual by their own family members, and they saw themselves as somewhat as a group of visual antis. So what Jamie told the police is that John and Robert Wagner started to investigate local pedophiles in the area who they wanted to knock off to help society. John and Robert Wagner referred to the local pedophiles as rock spiders, and their goal appeared to be to eliminate all of the local rock spiders. Jamie said that growing up he was aware of some of the rock spiders that they targeted, but it wasn't until he got a little bit older that John Bunting then started to force him and ask him to be involved with some of the murders. Over the course of several police interviews, Jamie informed the police that these murders, the serial killings, had been ongoing for almost a decade, spanning from 1992 till the end of the 1990s. Jamie was able to identify each person that was in the barrel, and there was actually 8 people in those barrels. The police believe that Jamie was somewhat honest, and he appeared to approach them because he genuinely felt guilty and remorseful for being involved in some of the later murders. So with respect to each murder, he started with Clinton Trezeas. Apparently Clinton was murdered by John Bunting on the 31st of August in 1992. He was 19 years old at the time of the murder. He was attacked inside John Bunting's house. He was knocked down and then attacked with a hammer. John Bunting cracked open his skull by repeatedly hitting him in the head with a hammer. So this is Jamie basically giving the police all of the details that the police need to be able to charge and then convict Wagner, Hayden, and Bunting. So he goes through all of the details of each of the murders. And as you are aware, they were only investigating 5 missing persons, and there's more people that he gave the names of and indicated that these 3 men were implicated in their murders. The next person was Ray Davies. He was murdered on the 21st of January of 1996. He was only 26 years old at the time of the murder. He was murdered inside Bunting's house because he was suspected to be involved in sexually abusing children. So he was one of the rock spiders. It was disclosed that Jamie's own mother was involved and assisted with this one. The next person was Suzanne Allen. She was found buried at the Salisbury house, and Bunting and Wagner both admitted to cutting up her body and burying her in the house. As I said, there was an allegation by Jamie Vazarkis that his own biological brother by the name of Troy had anally R-worded him when he was young. Apparently, the crime occurred when both Jamie and his brother were at home, and Jamie reported that he reported to John about the R word by Troy, and of course Bunting then considered Troy, the brother, to be one of the rock spiders that needed to be eliminated. The murder of Troy endured significant torture. So they got pliers and they pulled the nails of his toes off, and then they crushed the bones of his feet with the pliers. They electrocuted him in the bath. So the murder took place in the bathroom of the rental accommodation. They did the pliers on the toes. They electrocuted him. They then were sequentially suffocating him to death. They belted him with their fists and with other objects. He was also burnt repeatedly before he was finally murdered. Fred Brooks was another person who was aged 18 when he was murdered, and he was also tortured in a similar way to Troy between 16 and 19 September of 1998. His mother had a relationship with Bunting, and Bunting incorrectly assumed that Fred was a pedophile. You can see the trend. So they're killing the rock spiders. The police described the murder of Fred Brooks as the most horrific. He endured unspeakable acts of torture. He was burnt with cigarettes. He had, his toes were crushed with pliers. They put a lit sparkler down the eye of his member and restrained him until it burnt down and burnt his own flesh. The next person was Michael Gardner. He was murdered in 1997 because Robert Wagner found his homosexuality to be offensive. And so you can't say that they're vigilantes. They're just murderers. They're just murdering people. A lot of the people that they murdered weren't known. They didn't have a history of any type of sexual or anything like that. So I think they created this little fantasy in their mind that they were some type of vigilante, but no. Gavin Porter was aged 21 when Wagner strangled him to death in April of 1998. He was murdered because Bunting considered his life to be a waste because of his drug addiction. Gary O'Dwyer was 29 years old when he was murdered by Bunting, and Bunting said that he murdered O'Dwyer because he hadn't killed anyone in a while. I will put a photo of all of the victims just here. So Barry Lane and Clinton Tresalis were the ones that kind of kick-started the reinvestigation into these missing persons. And it turned out that Barry Lane, so he was a known pedophile, and Bunting was aware that he was a known pedophile, but what he did was he spoke to Barry, and Barry ended up giving them the list of the rock spiders because he had a lot of his friends were in the same circle and were into the same thing as him. So it was actually Barry Lane who ended up giving the list of rock spiders to Bunting to target. It is also interestingly said that apparently Clinton Tresalis, who he was actually involved in the murder of Barry Lane, and it is said that apparently he had very erratic emotional behavior, and that Wagner and Bunting decided to kill Clinton just because they were scared that he was going to end up telling on them and telling people and telling the wrong people about that, what they did to Barry Lane. Elizabeth Hayden. So it turned out that she was actually murdered because Mark had informed her about some of the things that they'd all done, and Bunting thought that she knew too much, so they had to get rid of her so she didn't spill the beans on what they'd all been up to. The 12th and final victim was a man named David Johnson. This was Jamie's stepbrother. He had an interest in computers, so what they told him was that there was a computer for sale at Snowtown. The computer didn't exist. He was lured into the bank vault building and he was ambushed by Bunting and Wagner. So Jamie's stepbrother David was said to be a little bit wealthier than Jamie and Bunting, and that kind of rubbed Bunting the wrong way. So he was only 24 years old when he was murdered by Bunting and Wagner in the bank vault. So it was David's murder that involved the aspect of cannibalism. So apparently after they killed him, they cut up his body and took a chunk of his flesh from the bank vault across to the person who was their friend from Snowtown. And they told the friend that they had some kangaroo to eat, and they cooked up David's body on the stove at the friend's house and served it to themselves. They both ate it, and they also gave it to their random friend who had no idea that the meat was actually a human. They thought that they were eating kangaroo meat. So that's where the cannibalism theme comes into it. Yeah, with David, they tortured him before they killed him, and they made him give up his credit card pin, and they took money from his account as well. And yeah, he was only 24 years old when he was murdered. When the police investigated Bunting's house, they said that they discovered photos of all of the rock spiders and all of the victims that were placed on his wall with like red string attaching all of the people together like a web, a planned, premeditated web of people that he intended to target with Wagner and sometimes with Hayden. John Bunting told the police that he could walk down the street and look at someone and know if they were a pedophile or not. So to me, it seems like his upbringing and the abuse that he endured growing up really took a massive impact on his mental health and his obsession with pedophilia. And the police say that John Bunting is someone who took extreme delight in controlling other people. And you can see this in the way that he tortured his victims for hours and hours, but also in the way that he attracted vulnerable people. Wagner was a vulnerable person that he attracted to be his henchman and his offsider, his best mate. Then you have Mark, again, led him to believe that he was this higher level of person and was like a secure family member. He also did this to Jamie. Jamie thought of him as a loving stepfather for most of his life until the guilt and the pressure of the murders finally caught up with him. In December of the year of 2000, the committal hearing for this case began, and there were 70 named witnesses. It's 6 months into the committal hearing, with the whole of Australia, if not the world, were watching this case. And on Thursday, 19 June of 2001, Jamie Vazarkis pled guilty to 4 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to 26 years in jail for his part in the killings. He accepted his punishment and became the star witness against his co-accused. Jamie really assisted the police in not only charging but also convicting Mark Hayden, Bunting and Wagner, because he was the storyteller. He told everyone not only the details behind who was killed and how they were killed, but why they were killed. And he kind of filled in the blanks for the police and really assisted them with prosecuting the cases against the other three men. The actual hearing against Bunting and Wagner started in 2002, and they were both charged with numerous counts of murder. Now, Mark Hayden, he was charged with 2 counts of murder and several other charges of assisting an offender, and he was actually trialed separately. The police officers commented that Bunting and Wagner showed no emotion when they were rehearing the witness statements or observing the gruesome facts of what they'd done. They showed no emotion during the hearing, and they were defiant, and they didn't seem to care. They showed no signs of remorse. The physical forensic evidence placed Wagner, Hayden and Bunting at the scene of the crimes, and also their DNA was on all of the objects that were used to dismember the people's bodies after they were murdered. It was also obvious that Hayden and Wagner had both rented the bank vault, which is where they ultimately left the bodies in the barrels. During the case, the police stumbled across several tapes that they weren't aware of previously, and on the tapes were the now deceased people basically saying things like, "I'm going away for a while, I've met someone, I'm not going to be back, look, just, you can use my money, you can use my place, I'm not going to be back for a while," stuff like that. So each of the missing persons, they had obviously forced to record these audio recordings, basically leading family and friends to believe that they were missing. And it turned out that a lot of those audio recordings were actually shown to family members and friends who were later investigated and spoken to, who had said, they called me and they told me that they'd met someone else and that they were moving, or that they wouldn't be back for a while. So they actually found the recordings that they'd forced the victims to make and showed their family and friends to give them more time and to support their story that these people had gone missing, rather than, and hence they were missing persons rather than criminal cases for so long. The nature of the recordings apparently is pretty gruesome and pretty brutal. They've never been released to the public to date. Police are reported to say that there was a small element of the pragmatic thief involved in these murders, but overwhelmingly they were the actions of sadists. So in July of 2003, the jury gave their verdict. Bunting and Wagner were found guilty on all counts, except there wasn't enough evidence to support or to show that they murdered Susan Allen. So they actually argued that she died of natural causes, and they cut her up and put her and buried her, and there wasn't enough of a case to prove that hadn't happened. During the reasoning, the judge commented that the pair took great delight in killing others, and that there was little chance of rehabilitation being successful. So 2 of the offenders were sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole, and Mark Hayden, he was convicted of assisting with the murders, but not in the actual murders itself. So as a consequence, Mark Hayden received a sentence of 28 years in prison. Yeah, as I said at the beginning of this video, only one of the murders actually took place in Snowtown, the stepbrother murder, the last murder. All the rest occurred in different parts of South Australia. And so it's kind of unfair that poor Snowtown has had this significant bad reputation since these murders, when only one of them actually took place in Snowtown. One of the things that is a little bit unique and strange about this case is that it is a group. It's multiple serial killers working together, and quite often you see that serial killers kill alone. But in this case, you have Bunting and Wagner, best friends, the 2 serial killers acting together on almost all of the murders. And Hayden's also in there too. And of course you have Jamie, who's also in there. It's kind of like a group of serial killers working together. This is and has been described as one of the worst serial killer cases in the entire Australian history. What do you think about this case? Have you heard about this case? There's actually a movie called Snowtown on this case on Stan. If you haven't seen it, it really does a good job. I think it's a good movie. It captures a lot of the elements of this case, and it really focuses on poor Jamie and his upbringing and how he kind of got roped into these murders and just the lifestyle, the suburb. I think it's a really good movie. If you haven't seen Snowtown on Stan, I suggest that you watch it. If you like this video, don't forget to actually like this video. And if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in the next one.